I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at a couple of ways that we can work with note repeats, adding extra spice to our MIDI programming using repeating notes. Firstly, let's work on a beat pattern and see how we can bring note repeat to life using drums. What I'm going to do first of all is just to program a really basic kick and snare pattern, and then we're going to bring note repeat to bear on a hi-hat pattern. Okay, so here's our pattern, and I'm just going to quantize that. And there is our kick and snare. Now what I want to do is to bring a hi-hat pattern in underneath this as well, but what I want to do is to have the option to bring in some note repeats. Now there's a little processor that we can use within Logic which is called note repeat, and the way that we can access that by default is to use a key command which is Option, Control and Return. And what that does is to bring up this little panel. And what this allows us to do is to configure the way in which note repeat can be added to a part which we can then manipulate in real time. So I'll show you how that works. By default, what happens when I turn on this or sort of bring to life this little note repeat panel is that instantly any note that I play will begin to just repeat. Okay, so at the moment we're hearing 16th notes, and that is the rate that's being set by this drop-down menu here. If I was to select 8th notes again, we'll hear that change. So effectively, I can just program a whole series of MIDI events, not as delay. This isn't a process sound, it's basically just generating repeating notes. But I can make life a little bit more interesting for myself than that by, well, let's go back to 16th notes here and then begin to see what happens when I manipulate note repeat in real time. So what I can do is to do this in a couple of ways. Firstly, I could use a controller such as the modulation wheel, which is the default option here. Again, I've got options. I can click here and choose a different controller if I want to. I'm going to stick with modulation. And then what I can do is to set a minimum and a maximum rate. Now what this means is that as I push the modulation wheel, we're going to move from this minimum value of a 16th note up to a 64th note. Okay, and what I can also do is to introduce both triplets and dotted notes as well, or in fact instead, so either triplet notes or dotted notes. And what that means is that we'll see now as I move through this range is that we'll see dotted values between the 16th and 32th notes, if you like, and we'll see a dotted 64th and then 1/64th at the top. Or alternatively, I can do the same thing with triplets if I want to bring a sort of triplet feel to the performance that I'm going to sort of produce for these note repeats in just a moment. So if I want to, I can do that, or I can just stick with the kind of straight quantized values if I prefer. So what we've got a chance to do here with note repeat is just to begin to sort of think, okay, well, how might this be a value? Well, let's have a look. What I'm going to do is to take this down to an 8th note, and I'll make the minimum value an 8th note, and we'll take the maximum value down to 1/32. And let's just program a hi-hat part to go underneath or on top of this kick and snare. Okay, so what we'll see now is that we've got these values as they have been recorded, but unlike the idea that this has been in some way achieved with delay, what we'll actually see, of course, is that I'm going to get a running series of notes which are reflected in those choices that I've recorded with my modulation wheel. In other words, we're actually getting separate MIDI events representing those different values as we move through them with the mod wheel. So instantly, this is a MIDI pattern which has been generated using note repeat, rather than this being produced in sort of post-production, or indeed with me having to sort of then go back and reprogram this part. And of course, the huge advantage of that is that if I suddenly decide, okay, well, actually, this pattern here at the beginning of bar 3, I want that to happen at the beginning of bar 2 as well, of course, I can just copy it and paste it into that position. And in fact, I really like bar 4. What I'm going to do is to get rid of bar 2 and simply select those notes and copy them backwards into that bar. Okay, so what else can we do with note repeat? Well, if you decide you don't want to use modulation as a means to trigger these different speeds, we can turn that off, and instead what we can do is to open up key remote instead. And what this allows me to do is to move through different values of rate, but triggered from different keys. You can see that this is the octave C1 and this is the octave of C. So what I'm in a position to do is to actually manipulate the rate. You can see the rate changing as I move through these different speeds. So if I wanted to, I can trigger the note here and make those changes with my left hand and sort of spin those in on the fly, which is particularly useful if you're working on a laptop and maybe you don't have access to your hardware controller at the time. So the key remote is a way of achieving the same thing, but using your keyboard. Okay, so that's one way in which we can work with note repeat. What I'm also interested in doing is seeing whether or not what I have a chance to do is to think about using note repeat in a different way, but as a MIDI processing plugin. You can see that under the drums in this project, what I've done is I've brought in the piano part, or I brought in a piano sound, which I'm going to add a MIDI effect to, which is called Note Repeater. And just like access to the arpeggiator and the other MIDI effects, I can grab that here. Note Repeater is this plugin here. Now, what this allows me to do is simply to play a note and then over MIDI for that note to be repeated. So if I play one note here, I'm going to hear those repeats. And again, that's MIDI generation. This is different from using a delay plugin where effectively those echoes are being processed and generated sort of over audio. So what are the benefits of working this way instead? Well, what the note repeater will allow us to do firstly is to set the number of repeats we want to hear. I'm going to keep that as 3 at the moment. What I can also do is to set a velocity ramp, which means that the first note can be the loudest with the subsequent notes, their velocity reducing. Or alternatively, what I could do would be to go the other way and actually have the first note be the quietest and have the velocities build from that point. So you can hear them becoming more intense, or I can go the other way so that they effectively disappear. Which is a really nice effect. What I can also do, because this is MIDI, is I can actually offset each step with its own transposition value. And this becomes really interesting, particularly on sounds like pianos or any pitched instrument, where now every repeat is going to be an octave higher than the previous one. So what we can do is to start thinking about maybe putting in a sort of piano part to go on top of these drums, where we've got the hats being, or having benefited from note repeat being sort of added in real time as we recorded that performance. And now this note repeater option being added to Unicorder as a MIDI effect. Okay, let's hear that back. I'm just going to quantize this performance. So I prefer that with 2 repeats. Let's also just see what happens when we change the delay speed. Let's take this up to a 16th. And that's really nice. And of course, bearing in mind we've got this as a MIDI effect at the moment, there'd be nothing to stop us adding audio effects as well. And of course, delay, I suppose, would be the really obvious one, just to add a really nice sort of smear to these sounds as they play back. works really, really nicely. So what we've done there in this video is to look at two versions of working with note repeat. Firstly, we've used this sort of processor, which we access through Option, Control, and Return. And that brings up the opportunity for us to introduce note repeats in real time as we play back. We did that via the modulation wheel, but you can just as easily use keys. And here we've used the note repeat MIDI effect, which allows us to have each MIDI event that we record be then duplicated. A second MIDI event will be triggered as a result, and a third and a fourth. We can produce velocity offsets and transposition offsets as well if we like. And there are all sorts of creative uses for those effects.